Hello，各位开源好伙伴，我是今天的主持人四猫猫。在开发的过程中，当代的数位产品几乎都会使用到自由开源软体，但除非公司已到达跨国的规模，设有专职的部门处理开源授权的开源合规问题，其实一般中小规模的厂商面对授权条款常常是一知半解。对工程人员来说，可能他会觉得这是法律的问题。那对于法务人员来说，他会觉得说，诶，这程式码之间的互动，我怎么会知道呢？那这场议程，我们邀请到来自 OpenChain Project 的 Sean 来为我们介绍。OpenChain Project 隶属于 Linux Foundation 之下，然后并且在去年成为 ISO 认证的一环。那这个专案如何就是来协助各位，就是利用标准的流程梳理复杂的授权问题，避免纷争之外，还能进一步贡献回上游，来达到一个正向的循环。那我们现在就立刻来看看 OpenChain 到底是怎么样的一个专案吧。This welcome Sean to share the future of compliance.
One, it's great to be back at COSCUP. I have been going to this event for so many years. I have no idea how long I've been going to the event, and that's wonderful. It's an opportunity always to learn new things and to meet interesting people. I'm so sorry that I can't be at COSCUP this year, that I can't meet you face to face, but we have this opportunity to hear from each other for a few minutes, and I will do my best to share something important and exciting. Our topic is open source and ISO standards. And I'll be talking about OpenChain and the future of compliance, because compliance is a very important part of open source and ISO standards. My name is Shane Coughlin. I'm the general manager of the OpenChain project at the Linux Foundation. This project is just one of several that addresses compliance and governance. For example, we have the SPDX project, which is about software bill of materials. We have the COSCUP project, which is all about OSPOs, open source program offices. And we have other projects like Fossology, which is about tooling and automation. These different parts of the Linux Foundation collaborate closely, and we work together for a simple goal: to have fantastic open source governance available for everyone, any company of any size in any market. Now, my perspective at the OpenChain project is very high level. In case you're not familiar with it, OpenChain ISO 5230 is a process management standard. In some ways, it's similar to ISO 9001, a quality process management standard. What OpenChain is doing is managing open source compliance. It identifies the points where you should put a process to have the key requirements of a quality open source compliance program. It's a simple standard. The entire ISO document is only 7 pages. So obviously, it's designed to be easy to adopt, easy to use, and of course, easy to understand. Now, when it comes to something like OpenChain as an ISO standard, or talking about software bill of materials, or talking about automation, or talking about OSPOs, the natural question is, why standardize? Why do things like bring everyone together to have certain ways of doing things? Doesn't that sound restrictive? And the answer is not the way we do it. We were very careful in making a standard like OpenChain to make sure that it would show you where to put a process, but it wasn't going to be prescriptive about how the process is filled. Instead of doing that, we created a very large international community, and we have a huge amount of reference material. Example training programs, example open source policies, None of them prescriptive, but all of them available for you to see. I'll give you an example. Many companies in the OpenChain community collaborated on making a training slide deck. And the idea was to have a really short example training deck that people could take and use, make parts of, expand for whatever they needed to train their people in open source compliance. Now, OpenChain says have a training program. It doesn't say how complex it has to be. It doesn't say how simple it should be. It says there should be a compliance program. Training should be available. And here are examples, many examples of what different companies do. Now, given that we're distilling something like compliance process management into an easy to understand way, the question is, does it work? Does a standard like OpenChain work to solve the problem? And the answer is yes. It is adopted by companies like Microsoft, Hitachi, LG Electronics, Toyota, Samsung Electronics, and many, many more. This is a standard that brought together, at this stage, thousands of people with decades of experience in open source to solve the problem conclusively. And it worked. Actually, OpenChain is a very interesting ISO standard. Did you know it's 14 years since the last time Linux Foundation made an ISO standard? The last time we made an ISO standard was Linux Standard Base, which you might remember was all about defining Linux. 14 years later, open source is massively successful. All of your companies use it. Every company everywhere uses it, basically. But with that success, came challenges with getting things reliable. And particularly in the supply chain, and I know how important Taiwan is in the supply chain. Particularly in the supply chain, we had challenges, company to company to company. Communication about process management, communication about software bill of materials, communication about other activities to make sure that the software going through the supply chain is conformant, compliant, and well understood. We had many challenges. OpenChain, I said, was a process management standard, very high level. It sets the framework. And after OpenChain, you say, okay, now we add software bill of materials. Now we add automation. OpenChain is the foundation for the future of compliance. Reliable, easy to adopt, easy to understand, clear standards. OpenChain is the first ISO standard out of the Linux Foundation to address this. And now we're moving down the stack. SPDX is a draft ISO standard as I record this. When you watch it, SPDX will probably be published. It's a software bill of materials. It has been developed over 10 years. It can be used in XML, JSON. It can even be used in spreadsheets. And it allows companies to transfer software knowing what it is, what license it uses, what version it is, and so on. With OpenChain and with SPDX, we are rewriting supply chain efficiency. And bear this in mind, it isn't just about, did we follow the license for legal reasons? It's also about, is this going smoothly, or do we have to waste time and therefore money on fixing stuff later? Every time a product gets near market and you find a problem and you have to go back through the supply chain, so much is wasted. OpenChain, SPDX, these are how we dramatically reduce waste, increase efficiency. This is it. This is the method. And that's why the companies all around the world are using it. I want to give you an example, a very, very concrete example. I mentioned companies that are OpenChain conformant. And those companies are huge. The fact that Toyota adopted OpenChain is world-changing for automotive. Microsoft, Google both use OpenChain. That's amazing. That changes cloud forever. LG Electronics and Samsung, wow, that shifts the needle on consumer electronics. But it goes further. What about a company not only adopting OpenChain, but asking their supply chain to use it explicitly? It's happening. For example, Scania, which is a Swedish truck company, it's part of Volkswagen Group. Scania has just released a new corporate standard, STD 4589. The Scania corporate standard explicitly asks suppliers to use OpenChain and use SPDX. And there you see the beginning of a very interesting future. It's happening elsewhere in automotive too. Scania is not the only company changing the supply chain. For example, Hitachi is OpenChain conformant, as is Panasonic, as is Bosch. All of these companies are suppliers to Toyota, and that plays a big part in what they're doing. What about all of the companies in Taiwan making stuff for Samsung or LG, Sony? Increasingly, you can expect your customer companies to ask you for OpenChain conformance and perhaps SPDX conformance. This is not a threat. This is not a challenge. This is an opportunity, two parts. The first part, stop wasting money. Stop wasting time going back and forth with customer companies because of problems. In Ireland, I remember being told that carpenters had a saying, and their saying was, measure twice, cut once. Having a process standard to make sure that things are going smoothly, having a software bill of materials means that you don't have to recut your process. You don't have to fix things all the time. And I'm sure that we both understand clearly how many companies in Taiwan don't have the people, the time, and the money to address these things again and again. These standards offer a very clean, clear way to resolve that. And there's a second part. The second part, quite frankly, is that the companies using the ISO standards, like OpenChain, are very visible as being right there beside Microsoft, Hitachi, Toyota, right there with the very best companies in the world doing compliance. It's a great way to advertise how your company has a mature approach to addressing process management in open source. Right. OpenChain, process management around open source compliance. SPDX, software bill of materials. Automation that's open source, like Glossology or Scan Code or open source review toolkit. None of those I'll go into today in depth, but there's a lot out there. From process to automation, you have standards and projects to support you. The ISO standards, like OpenChain, ISO 5230, or the forthcoming SPDX standard, these are the long-term, reliable, fixed parts of compliance. And that's important. The OpenChain ISO 5230 processes won't be suddenly changing on you. If you adopt these, it's just like ISO 9001 for quality. You are meeting the market requirements. You will meet it today, tomorrow, 1 year from now. It supports you in the long term. SPDX is a software bill of materials. The community spent 10 years making it. It's reliable. It's consistent. It's not going to be changing suddenly on you. This is how you solve things long term. But of course, there are aspects of compliance that aren't like that, where you have to evolve things quickly, like tooling, automation. You can expect tooling and automation, such as open source tooling, open source automation, not to be ISO standards. They have to change all the time. But what you can expect from open source tooling and proprietary tooling is that they will support OpenChain and SPDX. If they don't do it today, they will do it tomorrow. In our community, you'll find vendors like Synopsys, AusID, WhiteSource. All of them know exactly what we're doing and why we're doing it. All of them are getting ready for the future of OpenChain ISO 5230 being everywhere in the supply chain. And they're also getting ready for the future of SPDX being published as an ISO standard and every tool needing to ingest and export SPDX conformant information. And once that happens, company by company, department by department, everything becomes smoother. And that's the future of compliance. Standards for the stuff that doesn't change often, but we need. Active projects for the stuff that changes often. Everything working together in harmony, in collaboration. OpenChain, SPDX, To-Do Group, Quadsology, Open Source Review Toolkit, Synopsys, WhiteSource, AusID. We're communicating. And we're communicating in very interesting and clear ways. OpenChain is fully owned and controlled by user companies. It's not run by vendors at all. Then you have vendor companies like WhiteSource or AusID or Synopsys or Orpro. And of course, they have a very different perspective. But we all agree that the future of compliance is based on these ISO standards. It's based on collaboration. It's based on interoperability. And that's what we're building. That's why I'm here today, just to tell you what we're doing, because I need you. We have fantastic people in Taiwan working with the OpenChain project. But I want to work with more of you. There are companies in Taiwan that I'm not talking with actively today, like TSMC, MediaTek. I want to. I think we need to collaborate more and more closely. What's happening is a revolution that's going to save us so much time, so much money, and so much complication. Our next step, come to an OpenChain meeting. We have them physically when COVID allows, and virtually otherwise. In Taiwan, we hold the meetings in Mandarin. Come over, let's talk, let's share case studies, and let's build that future of compliance together. All right. There's a few questions in already. If it's okay, I'll start to answer those 3 questions.
Yeah, cool. Thanks to Sean's sharing.
Yeah. Let me start with... Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Okay, let's get started.
Okay.
Here you go.
So the first question I'd like to answer is about the price of the standard. If you go to the ISO website, in their normal store, they sell it for 58 Swiss francs. But you don't need to get the standard there. Go to our website, openchainproject.org. You can download the standard for free. Basically, ISO have a policy that everything on their main website, on their front website, they charge for. But we put the standard for free on our website, so you can get it anytime, openchainproject.org. The next question I'll answer is about whether American and European companies will ask Taiwanese companies to be OpenChain conformant. The basic answer is almost certainly this year, and definitely, certainly next year, many companies will be using OpenChain in America and in Europe, and they will be asking their supply chains to use OpenChain. We already see this with some companies. For example, Scania, the automotive company, is asking suppliers to use OpenChain. There are many companies in Europe and America that are OpenChain conformant. Companies like Bosch, which do a lot in automotive. Companies like Microsoft. And of course, we must not forget that there are many Japanese and Korean companies that use OpenChain. For example, Samsung, LG Electronics, Hitachi, Toshiba, Sony. So basically, yes, you can expect your customer companies to ask for OpenChain because it's an ISO standard. Right, the next question I'm going to answer is, apart from the fact that the US government is taking software bill of materials seriously, what other countries or organizations are also doing this? So the answer is very visible for me because I've been talking with them. The Japanese government is focused on software bill of materials and process management. So the Japanese government, the Ministry of Trade, recently released open source policy documentation, and they talk about OpenChain and SPDX. OpenChain for process, SPDX for software bill of materials. By the way, SPDX will be published in the next few days as an ISO standard, just like OpenChain. So basically with these three questions, we've touched on, do you have to pay for the standard? No. Go to openchainproject.org, it's free. Will customer companies in America and Europe ask for OpenChain? Yes, and also Japan, also Korea. Basically, OpenChain is just an ISO standard like every other standard. It's being included in the procurement discussion. So this leads to the next question. Is there any suggestion or strategy to push a company to join OpenChain? There's two parts, I think. First of all, as an ISO standard, it's going to be increasingly asked for in procurement. That's just what's going to happen. So at one point or another, companies will have to work with this. The second point is that even if a company is negative to open source issues, the company has to do some kind of process management. And if the company is doing something unique, something bespoke, something individual, it has to make up and improve and fix that on its own. If the company uses OpenChain, it's the minimum size effective method that every other company is beginning to use. So two parts. Your customers will want it, period. Second part, using OpenChain will mean that your process will be smoother. So it's going to be good for you with dealing with your customer companies, which are suppliers as well. It just means you reduce the amount of resources spent. If a company is really hesitant about open source issues or OpenChain, just point out that this ISO standard is like ISO 9001. It's about simple processes that fix a problem, and it's the world standard for it. I can help. Just contact me. Right. I believe we might have one or two more questions because Cat has another question or two.
Yeah, there are one question asking by in Chinese, and I'll translate for you.
Oh, I already translated that. That's the European and American customers,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. And
yeah, the American and European customers will ask for OpenChain. Just because it's part of the normal ISO standard.
okay, and I heard that Japanese government has begun to use the importance to the OpenChain standard. Can you share more detail about it?
Of course. So in Japan, about 2 years ago, the government started a cybersecurity initiative. Now that's focused on security, including government and military. But it meant that the government made a new strategy for software. And part of that strategy is about open source software. So the Ministry of Trade and Technology released documents in March in Japanese, and this week they released them in English. And the documents are guidance for using open source, guidance for security. When it comes to open source, the Japanese government basically said the standards are OpenChain for process, SPDX for software bill of materials. It's not a law. It is a recommendation by the government. But as you probably know, in Japan, those recommendations are very important to the companies. And actually, one reason that the Japanese government made this request, made this policy, is because of the Japanese companies. Toyota, Hitachi, Toshiba, Fujitsu, these are very powerful companies for politics, and all of them are OpenChain board members. So yeah, basically the biggest companies in Japan are using OpenChain, are gradually putting it out in their supply chain, and they helped guide the Japanese government into understanding what standards are really used. And now the Japanese government has said that OpenChain and SPDX are recommended. So it's a very big deal. It's a very big decision by the Japanese government.
Okay, it's about the time to say thank you for Shane to join us, and thank all the participants. If you have more questions, welcome to leave your thoughts, and please join the OpenChain mailing list. And we also have an OpenChain Taiwan working group website, and you can see a lot of materials in Chinese. And thank you, Shane, again. Hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much, Kat. I'll see you as soon as COVID slows down. I'm coming to Taiwan.
Okay. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.